So let's talk about collecting a Chaos Space Marine army of the foremost prophets of the Dark Gods and evangelize chaos across the stars with the Word Bearers. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Space Marines and more specifically Word Bearers with an army overview for collecting the faction in 10th edition with a few ideas as to how to realise their blasphemous host on the tabletop. In the video, let's talk about some of the reasons why you might want to collect Word Bearers, between lore miniature options and how to represent them on the tabletop, with a look over their model range, a few ideas for planning out an army, some thoughts on first purchases and options to expand, and a look over some relevant datasheets and some Pactbound Zealots. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. Starting out with their rather fun lore, the Word Bearers are the 17th Legion of Chaos Space Marines, the gene sons of Lorgar, the first Primarch to be corrupted by the machinations of chaos or to have seen the light of the true deities of the universe. Opinions might vary on that. Lorgar and the Word Bearers were forbidden from worship of the Emperor himself, and ultimately went in search of truer, greater powers worthy of their respect, spreading the knowledge to the other Chaos Primarchs and Horus himself in particular, with the Legion maybe being unique amongst their brothers as utterly fighting to evangelise the faith of the ruinous powers and act as a Legion of Chaos undivided, not pledging themselves to any one deity unlike some of their brothers. In battle, their darkly zealous hosts might take to war, all covered in heretical inscriptions both on their armour and their skin, excerpts from the Book of Lorgar or other manner of demonic texts, and hosts of them often tend to be led into battle by dark apostles, commanding throngs of zealous cultists that they've converted to their religion, and along with all the trappings of a Chaos Space Marine Legion, they tend to make unusually great use of demons, a massive amount of possessed amongst their ranks, a continuation of the horrors of the Gal Vorbak from the Horus Heresy, and might be expected to make war with summoned demons aiding them more so than some of the other legions. In the more current 40k narrative, their legion is far more intact than some of their brother Primarchs, ones like the Night Lords, Emperor's Children, and World Eaters, often more fighting as smaller warbands, whereas the Word Bearers tend to be more cohesive and whole, a mighty force to be reckoned with, and able to wage great dark crusades or lay siege to entire subsectors. They particularly tend to be the bitter rivals of the Ultramarines following their brutal battles in the Horus Heresy, particularly at Calth, and Lorgar himself is known to be active in the galaxy of the 41st millennium. His last main appearance in the lore was seen fighting Corvus Corax deep in the Eye of Terror, and ultimately forced to flee from him, holding up in his tower. There have been whispers of him leading great hosts of Word Bearers to convert the masses in the Indomitus era after the opening of the Great Rift. Miniature-wise, the Word Bearers make good use of the large and established Chaos Space Marine miniature range, which I say is quite a good one by general 40k standards. Most of their core kits have been redone somewhat recently over the past 5 years or so. There are certainly some older models around, things like bikers and some of the tanks and demon engines in particular, and a few others. The miniatures tending to be rather busy with a whole bunch of trim and spikes. There's not a huge amount of support for the individual legions in Warhammer 40k, at least not beyond the deity legions, which each have their own small range now. The Word Bearers don't really have anything specifically aimed at them, though I feel like compared with some of their brother legions, they're really quite well represented by the more general Chaos Space Marine kits. All spikes, Chaos Undivided and Blasphemy fits them quite well, maybe a bit more than certain other ones who might be more tempted to do things their own way, and there certainly are some unique units that fit the Word Bearers flavour absolutely perfectly. Chaos Space Marines in general have a bunch of cool minis, their standard legionary troops going on dark crusades with chainsword and bolt gun, or scuttling demon engines such as this Venom Crawler here. They do generally tend to be very busy models with lots of spikes and trim, which does mean they can be rather infamous for taking a while to paint up. There's a massive amount of options open to them. There's mortal hanger-on cultists, soaring warp talons, Chaos Lords might have ascended to mighty demon princes, shedding their mortality for great gifts, and there's plenty of the regular Space Marine trappings such as Predator or Vindicator tanks for some big guns to back up their elite infantry, many of which wants to be in melee quite a lot. For things that feel particularly stylised to the Word Bearers, for the HQs as well as the Demon Prince, the Master of Possession I feel fits them rather well. Basically a sort of shaman psyker, ready to rustle up a bunch of demons from the pit and twist some Chaos Space Marines or cultists into abominations, and the Dark Apostle in particular, complete with his burning book and sinister little mortal acolytes. He feels like a very Word Bearers model. Otherwise, Mortal and Chaos Space Marine possessed models feel like they fit in rather well, a tide of troopers enhanced by their patron deities in all rather disturbing and disgusting ways. If you wanted a bit more specifically modelled Word Bearers flavour, then the main way to get that would be for their Horus Heresy range. They've got some really good tailor-made sculpts here. I feel like both of their Praetor models are rather standout, with their armour all inscribed and a bunch of Legion-specific trappings around them. I quite like the burning mace on the Terminator one on the right. and Argyltaur's one of the example of their character models having some fun lore in the Horus Heresy series that you could use him as a stand-in for things in 40k. You can also put Erebus on the table as well if you want to add one of the most despised characters in 40k to your ranks. They've got some other fun stuff though, such as a Possessed Dreadnought and the early Possessed in the Galvorback. As mentioned, their Primarch is very much still around and active in the lore. He's got a miniature for the Horus Heresy if you wanted to field him. I think if you wanted to represent him in a game with current Warhammer 40k rules from the core Chaos Codex, I'd use him as a stand-in for Abaddon the Despoiler. I feel like he'd fit the part fairly well, having some Primarch level melee threat and some big reality warping command abilities. It seems likely that at least somewhere down the line he'll probably get a new model or two, maybe a transfigured one for the Horus Heresy, and probably a plastic one for 40k eventually, though Games Workshop do like to space out their Primarch models really quite infrequently, and no guarantees that he'd necessarily be the top of the list for the remaining Chaos ones to come back. In general though, unless you're digging into expensive Forge World models quite too heavily, Chaos Space Marines could be one of the slightly cheaper armies to collect in Warhammer 40k, at least having reasonable amounts of points per the models that you put on the table. Probably not the very cheapest without so many options for big discount sets, but not one of the most expensive either. Gameplay wise, the Wordbearers use their rules from Codex Chaos Space Marines like the rest of them. I feel like the core rule is appropriate enough for them with their Dark Pacts, getting lethal hits or sustained hits from their deities, so some nice Chaos boons there. Chaos Marines both have range and melee forces, and that feels appropriate enough for the Wordbearers themselves. Generally, Chaos armies tend to skew a fair bit more towards melee compared with their Loyalist counterparts, but can do both at least fairly well in 10th. I'd argue that perhaps the Wordbearers aren't super well represented by the detachments. They got the Index one in the Pactbound Zealots, which on the one hand I still think is a very fun detachment. Marking different units to the different Chaos deities at least feels fairly appropriate for them in the lore. But on the other hand, it does really feel like a more general purpose Chaos one to me, as opposed to really being themed for them. I think what you want to see for a Wordbearers detachment will be things more themed around Dark Apostles, Possessed, Summoned Demons, and maybe Cultists and the like. I wonder if there could be some possibility of us getting something like that in one of the sort of spot added in datasheets that Games Workshop seem to be doing over 10th. With the detachment system though, you can choose any of the rest of them, and it feels like most of them will be pretty good at representing Wordbearers. Creations of Bile Renegade Raiders seem to be having the most success in tournaments at the moment, and both of those can do well enough with some of their themed units, like say Possessed being extra nasty in a Creations list. I feel like Chaos Cult could be interesting enough for them as well, representing them having converted a bunch of mortals to their cause and maybe done horrible things to them and turn a bunch of them into accursed cultists. In any case, if you want to collect an army of the foremost evangelists of the Dark Gods, maybe the Wordbearers might be the army for you. If you do choose to collect an army of them, plenty of places to find more about Wordbearers and Chaos Space Marines in general. Picking up the Codex at some point for 10th edition wouldn't be the worst. That'll have the unit profiles, lore and miniature galleries from Games Workshop. But if you want to go in depth about the big history of the Legion, which is pretty well documented, there's a vast amount of lore in the Horus Heresy series in particular. Lots of novels featuring the Wordbearers. You can mess around with army lists on things like New Recruit, Warhapedia or Games Workshop's app. Potentially proxy models with Tabletop Simulator, and there's loads of stuff here on YouTube. I made a Chaos Space Marine overview in the past, though a few more recent videos include a strong Chaos Space Marine army list overview and rating each unit in the Codex. I'll link those ones down in the video description. Plenty of battle reports, painting guides and all sorts of lore on other channels as well. It's often a handy enough idea to follow along with some faction-specific Discords, Facebooks or subreddits, which can be a good place to pick up some info on passing, or ask a few basic questions if you're new to 40k or Chaos Marines in general. Often when starting a 40k army, it can be worth planning out, say, a rough 1,000 point or 2,000 point list, maybe using New Recruit, and it can just force you to think about what sort of Chaos Space Marine army you might like to wind up with and set some rough goals, even if you might go on to make alterations and change things as you go on to learn a bit more about the faction and what you like and don't. Lots of players for Chaos Marines just tend to build kind of balance, adding the units that they take a shine to, either in terms of core models or being effective enough in the game to crush the enemies of the Dark Gods. I feel like most people who collect Wordbearers would tend to build up a fair few of the units they're better known for, things like Dark Apostles, Possessed, Cultists, and maybe some of the regular Chaos Space Marines and their elite equivalents like Terminators and Chosen. As mentioned, you could build around one of the certain detachments. There are a big 9 of them, including that Pactbound one, and you could decide whether or not you're going to stick fairly closely to the actual Wordbearers theming and just go very much as per the standard Legion, or have a ward band that might be shaped and led by one given Chaos Lord who might diverge from their parent Legion to a greater or lesser extent. You could also do allies as well, which can change a bit from 40k editions to edition, adding in Chaos Knights or Demons. In general, Summoned Demon allies seem appropriate enough for them, though I'd certainly bear in mind that Games Workshop does like to change the sorts of units that can be allied every so often, so it might just be a little bit less guaranteed to work properly in the future if you're doing that. Another thing to plan out is the sort of paint that you'd be putting on the miniatures. I'll probably start out with a regular Chaos Space Marine Legionary as a good place to begin the army. They're relatively representative of the faction as a whole, and a bit of a lower investment versus an enormous vehicle or character unit, and I personally work out a colour scheme and decide whether you like it or not, or whether or not there's any shifts that you could do to trade one thing for another, and make them a bit more in the style that you'd like. There's plenty of examples of people painting up word bearers of various flavours online. If you take a look on YouTube, you'll get a whole bunch of different examples with slightly different techniques. Games Workshop has at least one Horus Heresy focused one. For word bearer specific ones, other content creators might be able to help you out quite well though. Chaos Space Marines generally tend to have a lot of trim, particularly for models like the Helldrake and a few others. Bear in mind it might be easier to spray the trim colour on certain models from sometimes and shade in the patches, or you could go for a colour scheme that doesn't paint the trim in a different colour. There are some that do that, but in general I do think that the contrast looks kind of good on a lot of stuff. You could also decide whether or not you're going to try and do some sort of Legion iconography. Perhaps the cheapest and cost efficient way would be to go via 3D printing creators there. They generally have at least some representation for, say, Legion specific shoulder pads for the bigger and better known Legions and chapters of 40k, and you might have a few other fun things like certain themed heads or other icons and things that could be of use on bigger kits like vehicles. For ideas for first purchases, kind of in line with that, I'd probably go for something with the Chaos Space Marine Legionaries kit in it. The Codex could be quite a good early purchase, and then I'd probably go for either Combat Patrol Chaos Space Marines at the moment, or box set of the Legionaries, which you can either get with or without the Kill Team upgrades. There's basically a slightly more expensive version that has the Reaper Chain Cannon and the Balefire Tome and things, which isn't strictly 100% needed. I feel like it's probably a good enough value to justify the extra spend on the upgrade to the kill team though. It's not a vast amount of different price, and some of the bits that you get are quite cool. Otherwise, beyond either discount things I tend to prioritise would be a mix between the models that you find cool, either compelling from the lore or just look awesome, and likely some efficient heavy damage dealer units that can handle enemy tough stuff. Just so that when you take your forces to the tabletop, and if you say you came against a knight army list or a big force of Tyrian monsters or something, you've got adequate things to be able to take down big tough targets and not just a bunch of stuff to take out light infantry. For the Chaos Space Marine Combat Patrol, I feel like this one actually serves word bearers about as well as it possibly could. All of the units are ones that you'd expect them to use. There's a Master of Possession, 5 Possessed, 10 Cultists and 10 Chaos Legionaries. I believe you don't get the upgrade sprue in that one though. The price of this one is £100 or $168 and the discount versus buying individually is around about 27% or so. So alright, but not crazy standout I'd say. It does get you at least a good chunk of points towards an army at around 400 points or so in the box. Units wise, most of them are pretty good at the moment. Legionaries are a common staple in most Chaos Space Marine lists, good damage dealing and a good escort for lords, often seen jumping out of rhinos. Cultists are really nice for expendable units with their sticky objectives rule. Possessed can run fast and hit hard, often used as a solid central damage combo. The only one that's a bit of a dud rules-wise at the moment is the Master of Possession, which is a bit of a shame given how cool this model is. Generally when people put Possessed on the table in more competitive armies, he doesn't generally tend to make the cut, and that might just discourage repeat purchases a bit. In general, when buying Warhammer 40k miniatures, if you're newer to the hobby, I'd certainly be aware of the various different options open to you. Direct from Games Workshop's Warhammer web store is generally the most reliable, but also the most expensive. Most people usually tend to buy from discount retailers around the world, selling exactly the same Warhammer products but at a discount compared with the main company's store. I've got a bunch of those links down in the video description. Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21%, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10%, Wargame Portal in the USA for 15%, and Taschengeldy from Germany and the EU for 16%. Those savings do add up to quite a bit compared with buying from Games Workshop over the years, and if you buy through any of them linked in the video description for this one, it helps to support the channel a bit, so a big thank you to anyone choosing to do that when they pick up model soldiers. New plastic kits from discount retailers aren't the only option though. Chaos Space Marines are a popular army and you often have a good amount of stuff turning up for them second hand. Might be checking out eBay where you might be able to save a fair bit of money and potentially time and effort in modelling, though obviously quality can be very variable. And 3D printing and third-party manufacturers are a good option as well. There's lots of great alternative sculpts out there, plenty of demons and heretical stuff for guys in power armour. Could be good enough to fit the part, either just for some cool alternative sculpts or potentially to save money. The Ravage Star miniatures by Mini Wargaming are quite a fun one in my opinion. Otherwise, beyond discount kits and a few Legionaries, let's take a look at some of their more iconic units. The Possessed, as mentioned, are a pretty nice general purpose, fast moving danger unit. They move 9 inches, are fairly sturdy with 3 wounds at toughness 6 and a bunch of strength 5 damage 2 attacks, and they get devastating wounds on one big turn. Lots of detachments can make them a bit better, say Renegade Raiders where they could get extra AP. anything that can give them advance and charge, or big rerolls, say in Pactbound Zealots with Undivided. Dark Apostles cost 75 points to put on the board, and they give you a +1 to wound in melee. In general, I feel like they are pretty efficient leader characters, a good damage boost and some melee of their own. They also give you better leadership and warding against battle shock, and their Dark Disciples are actually quite useful for the unit as well. You could tank some big high AP hits on them, particularly as they get a 4+ invulnerable save, and you could also sacrifice them for mortal wounds as well. Perhaps one of the biggest weaknesses for them is that you have 3 models in the unit, so they don't fit very neatly into Rhino transports alongside Legionaries or Chosen. And the Chaos Lord hits incredibly hard in close combat, and is often a pretty direct rival for this guy if you have to choose between one or another to lead a unit. Accursed Cultists are quite fun models to get some mutant hordes on the board alongside your Space Marines if you'd like. They get a bunch of small mutants and a few big ones that hit fairly hard with their hideous mutations. They're disturbing foes to fight on mid-board objectives, as it means that if the opponent shoots them, they might just walk into close combat with enemy units. And that can be very problematic if people wanted to fire at them with multiple units in succession and couldn't afford to have things in melee. They can often be paired with a Dark Commune for a 5+ invulnerable save and a big turn of boosted damage. They may be a bit more niche strength-wise at the moment, but can be very nice if you want to play Chaos Cult with big board control danger with them. There's loads of options to expand from there. In Codex Chaos Space Marines, Rhinos tend to be a good choice to deliver either Chosen or Legionaries into battle. A nice battlefield bunker to keep them safe and give them a bit more threat range when they jump out. Chosen themselves as well are very popular units to run with things like Chaos Lords that can get good enough mileage out of the Dark Apostle buffs if you want them to. Some gun tanks to support the masses can be nice as well. Vindicators, Forge Fiends and Predators are all usable enough, or some big hitting firepower from some Obliterators. And as mentioned, Chaos Lords generally tend to be some of the standout leaders of their warbands. Massive melee damage with Demon Hammers, particularly with Legionary rerolls on the go. Otherwise, from another perspective, you could focus on some of the units that get you a lot of points on the board for the money. The Warpforged one with the Obliterators and the Venom Crawler is appropriate enough for that, and I guess they do have demons in them, even if the Word Bearers perhaps go in for more sort of infantry possessed as opposed to biomechanical possessed. They're both cool models in my opinion though. And then the Chaos Terminators can be another cheapish way to get a lot of points on the board comparatively, and just rather iconic Elite Chaos models in general. Currently I'd rate them as usable enough, though maybe not quite as standout as say Chosen or Legionaries for core damage combos with Lords. There's also a bunch of past discount kits for the Chaos Space Marines as well, most of which won't generally turn up at reasonable prices that are worth paying for. The Veterans of the Long War and the Dread Talons ones were their 10th edition offerings, though they sold out really quite quickly. They've had others like the previous Combat Patrol set that's been coming out in some kits available from Combat Patrol magazines in the UK, and that does mean that you might see a few more things being resold as individual issues that could build some of the units there. A few of them need 2 issues to make 1 unit though. And towards the end of 9th edition there were some other discount sets, a Boarding Patrol and a Battlefleet Battle Force box. Just bear in mind that these box sets only generally tend to be worth it if they actually do have a significant discount versus buying the same kits from a discount retailer, so do the math on them if you are getting offered them for a higher price. Finally, it might be slightly more niche appeal, but I'd also bear in mind that as well as some expensive resin Word Bearers themed things, the Horus Heresy has a lot of fairly cheap plastic Space Marines as well. The Horus Heresy Age of Darkness box gets you a pretty crazy amount of Space Marines on the board, plus a Spartan that you could run as a Land Raider, some Terminators that you could run as Chaos Terminators, and a Dreadnought that you could use as a Hellbrute. It'll give you a bit more of a clean and heresy era vibe to your army. The fighting with older armor marks isn't exactly the most inappropriate for Chaos Legions in 40k. And if the main target is to get as many Space Marines on the board for as little money as possible, this could be a pretty reasonable option. I'd also look into things like the Legion Tactical Squads and the Legion 10-man Terminator Squads. Both of those will get you a few more models on the board for your pounds or dollars compared with the 40k box sets right now. Generally though, my scope for expanding the army would be to have a heavy hint of just collect what you like the look of. 40k rules tend to change over time, and in particular the absolute top meta stuff will frequently shift around with balance updates, and in 10th edition Games Workshop has managed to make at least the majority of the Chaos Codex really quite usable. A few things maybe stand out as bad still. They seem to be making flyers and fortifications really quite bad, and they haven't been very kind to the Lord Discordant or the standard Chaos Space Marine Sorcerer model in terms of rules in 10th edition, though I still rate the majority of units in the book as being very solid and playable to the highest level of the game in the right army list. My general aim would be to probably start with a force that gives you enough models on the board to play some initial games, and then gradually expand slowly from that, getting a batch of models painted, then buying the next thing, expanding in small chunks until you get a bigger and bigger Chaos army. Finally, for a few options to put them on the board, as mentioned, the closest thing that the word bearers have to a themed attachment is the Pactbound Zealots one. It maybe feels a little bit word bearers adjacent. It does have a name that sort of resembles them, but more sort of feels just worship of the individual chaos deities more so than legion specific to them. Though as mentioned, I really do quite like the core mechanic of it. You mark every unit in your army to either Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh or Chaos Undivided, and then that boosts your Dark Pacts in one way or another. Nurgle tends to be really quite popular for shooting units, Slaanesh for some melee things, and Undivided for anything that really likes the big rerolls, like Forge Fiends or Possessed maybe. Each of those also comes with access to boosted stratagems, like Nurgle can have a Shrouded one, Slaanesh can advance and charge, and Undivided gets some nasty reroll wounds. At the moment it's not really considered to be the absolute top tier most powerful chaos detachments, though not really too far behind the leaders. It's certainly scary enough leaning into big damage dealers that hit really hard. They're not quite as reliable as it used to be in its index form, as you only get the boost to the damage output if you don't fail your leadership on Dark Pacts, and it can maybe make you want to tailor a bit closer to units with icons perhaps. You can get quite a fun Demon Prince in the detachment as well with a 5+ feel no pain on one, and that could be a fun example for another Word Bearers model to put on the board. Loads of good options though, and I wouldn't feel restricted to that. I feel like the Chaos Space Marine ones are close enough in supporting similar units that a very similar list can work pretty well in multiple of these. Renegade Raiders is also really general purpose, and the Creations of Bio one skews a bit more towards melee infantry, but again could be a fun one to make some seriously amped up Possessed, and maybe just go with your headcanon for that detachment, being that it's giving them demonic boons more so than Fabius augmentations. Finally, here's just one themed 2000 point army list for what a Word Bearers army could look like on the table, hopefully striking some sort of balance between an army that's fairly effective on the board and also using a bunch of their iconic choices. It's roughly 2000 points but not exact, it might be just a few points over, though I'm sure that will change over time as Games Workshop raises and lowers certain points cost. In any case though, leading the army we've got a Slaanesh Dark Apostle with 10 chosen. They'll be Undivided marked, and they can advance and charge natively, and potentially be getting both +1 to wound and 4 reroll wound rolls, so should be a force that can rip apart just about anything. Then for another big melee punch threat, there's 2 Chaos Lords, each with a Demon Hammer and with a unit of Legionaries in a Rhino. They're Slaanesh marked to advance and charge if needed. Then there's 2 big blocks to possess, one unit of 10 that's joined by the Master of Possession, maybe not the most competitively optimal thing ever, but feels on point and uses the contents of the combat patrol, and another smaller unit to fight alongside. And then we've got a big unit of Accursed Cultists, Nurgle marked with the Dark Commune, and that should give them the option to be shrouded and make themselves a nuisance to be removed from the table if needed. Lots of big skirmishy units to scrap for the mid-board there. Then we've got a Winged Demon Prince with the Elixir enhancement, so a bit harder to kill than most there. Potentially could be a rapid ingress threat. A unit of Nurgle marked Chaos Cultists to hold down the home board objective and provide their sticky objectives there. And then just for a little bit of unholy firepower, there's a Chaos Vindicator, taking Nurgle for some big sustained hits on a 5+, which should mean that enemy armor shouldn't be able to fully relax around that, potentially with a big armor punch. I feel like if you're maybe trying to make it a little bit more competitive, you might take out a few things for a bit more armor and firepower. You could perhaps trade out the Winged Prince, the Accursed Cultist, and the Master of Possession. I put a whole bunch more gun tanks in there, like Vindicators, Forge Fiends, or Predators. Hopefully it should be at least a somewhat effective army on the board though, and certainly fun using a bunch of the themed units, and loads of big melee threats. I think I'll leave this one there for now though. Let me know your thoughts on collecting Word Bearers in 10th edition down in the comments. Look forward to hearing all your takes as always. Feel free to check out that Strengths and Weaknesses of Chaos Space Marine units video. That'll be links down in the video description. And subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. If you found the video useful and you'd like to help support, as well as the affiliate discount links that are down in the video description, I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. That one has a few benefits, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.